Good evening and welcome to the DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 13th of August 2026. Let's begin with the top 5 highest yielding listed corporate bonds. At number 1, Monedo Financial Services Private Limited recorded a yield of 17.00% with a trade value of 14.00 lakh rupees. At number 2, Monedo Financial Services Private Limited recorded a yield of 16.75% with a trade value of 12.00 lakh rupees. At number 3, Regency FinCorp Limited recorded a yield of 16.00% with a trade value of 39.30 lakh rupees. At number 4, Unifins Capital India Limited recorded a yield of 15.65% with a trade value of 8.20 lakh rupees. And at number 5, Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.50% with a trade value of 50.00 lakh rupees. Moving to the top 5 highest yielding unlisted corporate bonds. Port East Investment Private Limited recorded the highest yield at 19.75% with a trade value of 500.00 lakh rupees. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of 1,919.17 lakh rupees. Edelcap Securities Limited recorded a yield of 12.28% with a trade value of 15.00 lakh rupees. Kakinada SEZ Limited recorded a yield of 11.5682% with a trade value of 25,000.00 lakh rupees. And Nuvama Wealth Finance Limited recorded a yield of 9.00% with a trade value of 50.00 lakh rupees. Now, let's look at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 0.00 crore rupees. Gross sales also stood at 0.00 crore rupees. Net investment was 0.00 crore rupees. Meanwhile, net investment for August, month to date, stood at negative 932.150 crore rupees. Moving to FPI debt market investment. Under the general limit, gross purchases stood at 723.17 crore rupees. Under VRR, gross purchases stood at 318.54 crore rupees. Under FAR, gross purchases stood at 1,058.76 crore rupees. For gross sales, the general limit recorded 1,264.50 crore rupees. VRR recorded gross sales of 150.17 crore rupees, and FAR recorded gross sales of 358.68 crore rupees. Looking at net investment, the general limit recorded negative 541.33 crore rupees. VRR recorded net investment of 168.37 crore rupees, and FAR recorded net investment of 700 crore rupees and 8 lakh rupees, equivalent to 700.08 crore rupees. For August, month to date, net investment under the general limit stood at 1,591.84 crore rupees. Under VRR, it stood at negative 280.13 crore rupees, and under FAR, it stood at 1,025.98 crore rupees. Looking at 2026 year to date, on a calendar year basis, net investment under the general limit stood at 58,029 crore rupees. Under VRR, it stood at negative 13,570 crore rupees, and under FAR, it stood at 40,324 crore rupees. Now, let's turn to money market rates. The call rate stood at 5.20%. The T-repo rate stood at 5.09%. The basket repo rate stood at 5.17%. And the special repo rate stood at 5.04%. Moving to India government bond yields. The 1-year yield stood at 5.73%. The 3-year yield stood at 6.18%. The 5-year yield stood at 6.35%. The 7-year yield stood at 6.66%. The 9-year yield stood at 6.75%. The 10-year yield stood at 6.76%. The 15-year yield stood at 6.96%, and the 30-year yield stood at 7.36%. For T-bill yields and auction cutoffs, The 91-day yield stood at 5.26%, the 182-day yield stood at 5.54%, and the 364-day yield stood at 5.71%. Now, let's look at liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative 214,886 crore rupees. The standing deposit facility, or SDF, stood at 161,637 crore rupees, and the marginal standing facility, or MSF, stood at 596 crore rupees. Moving to MIBOR OIS rates. The one-year rate stood at 5.75%. The two-year rate stood at 5.95%. The three-year rate stood at 6.06%. And the five-year rate stood at 6.26%. For modified MIFOR rates, the two-year rate stood at 6.82%. The three-year rate stood at 6.87%. The four-year rate stood at 6.95%. And the five-year rate stood at 6.99%. Moving to currency rates. The US dollar to Indian rupee rate stood at 95.42 rupees, compared with the previous rate of 95.34 rupees. The euro to Indian rupee rate stood at 110.08 rupees, compared with the previous rate of 110.06 rupees. The British pound to Indian rupee rate stood at 128.71 rupees, compared with the previous rate of 128.95 rupees. The Japanese yen to Indian rupee rate stood at 0.60 rupees, unchanged from the previous rate of 0.60 rupees. And the Chinese yuan to Indian rupee rate stood at 14.14 rupees, unchanged from the previous rate of 14.14 rupees. Now, let's look at commodities and indices. 24-karat gold with 99.9% purity stood at 15,360 rupees per 10 grams, compared with the previous price of 15,486 rupees per 10 grams. Silver stood at 2,550 rupees per 10 grams, unchanged from the previous price of 2,550 rupees per 10 grams. Crude oil stood at $87.35, compared with the previous level of $89.18. The Sensex closed at 78,079.96, compared with the previous level of 77,966.35, and the Nifty closed at 24,395.85, compared with the previous level of 24,435.95. Finally, let's look at India's primary issuance of corporate bonds. IKF Finance Limited issued 175 crore rupees with a tenure of 26 months and a coupon of 9.00%. The rating was AA- assigned by Care Ratings Limited. SK Finance Limited issued 500 crore rupees with a tenure of 36 months and a coupon of 9.10%. The rating was AA- assigned by India Rating and Research Private Limited. Mufin Green Finance Limited issued 75 crore rupees with a tenure of 16 months and a coupon of 10.85%. The rating was A-, assigned by Acquite Ratings and Research Limited. RDC Concrete India Limited issued 50 crore rupees with a tenure of 31 months and a coupon of 11.00%. The rating was A-, assigned by Acquite Ratings and Research Limited. And Tata Capital Housing Finance Limited issued 750 crore rupees with a tenure of 38 months and a coupon of 7.86%. That's all for today's DebtCircle Sundown brief. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to DebtCircle for more updates from India's debt and fixed income markets.